What's up? It's your boy Gobble Gamble, and I literally just recorded this whole video with my mic muted. So I'm about to do this again. But you know what time it is. You see the hat. I'm going to take you through a Week 15 recap of how we performed in cash games and tournaments and give you some takeaways that I think could be valuable for the future for NFL DFS and even for other sports that I think it can be viable for. If you enjoyed this content, especially because I had to record this twice, definitely like and subscribe. It's greatly appreciated by me, and it's going to help the channel grow and help me keep giving you more content that'll be helpful for you. And hit that notification bell so you know when there's new content up and live on YouTube. So let's get into it. All right, so here are my two cash lineups. My main lineup over on the left side, I entered in my head-to-heads, and my secondary lineup that I just entered into a couple of double ups. So both lineups performed well. Second lineup performed much better, but I was able to hit the cash line in all of my double ups, and I won 75% of my head-to-heads. So definitely feel good about the result there. Now the head-to-head scores were very close for most of my head-to-heads. So kind of eked out a couple victories. I had one victory by 0.18 points, which is 4.5 passing yards, essentially, from a quarterback. So, got on the right side of some variance there, but, win is a win. And I think from a process standpoint, I could take a look at the lineup and kind of break it down a little bit further to see, kind of how we could have maybe made some different decisions or whether these decisions were valid. So, starting at the top at quarterback, felt like Lamar, Jalen Hurts, and Kyler were the three main cash quarterbacks that were the choices there. Had Goff and Tannehill kind of on the outside looking in there as sort of secondary options, but it's good to know I pretty much couldn't have gone wrong outside of Goff there at quarterback. Jalen Hurts and his performance was really, really promising, I think, for the future. We saw what he could do when given an opportunity to throw even more and just with his running ability. And I think it's important with quarterbacks in particular that they have access to both a rushing floor and that rushing in turn giving them a ceiling when they have access to a high touchdown equity. So I definitely liked Lamar and Kyler a little bit more from that standpoint with regard to the touchdown equity if we were looking at the Vegas totals. Lamar himself was very efficient. Obviously didn't play most of the fourth quarter, so that score could have been even higher if the game was close. But saw him put up, three touchdowns passing, and in addition to that, get one in on the ground. So definitely a solid performance from Lamar. And in these type of setups, I think we can roll with the expectation that most of the time it's going to be very efficient. So, that efficiency does help even when we don't get the volume that we would have liked from our quarterback there. Tony Pollard, obviously with the news for Ezekiel Elliott being out, to me that made Tony Pollard a plug and play there at running back. This was initially the place where Leonard Fournette was in my cash lineups. And I did mention, on my Twitch stream that I wasn't really in love with Leonard Fournette as a play. Turns out that he was just fine and performed really well in that matchup. But was happy to get off of that and get to what I felt was a better value play there, Tony Pollard, and it was very very solid performance and encouraging. He played 90% of snaps and got 75% of the running back rushes for Dallas. So if that continues, if Zeke is out, and I think even boding for the future beyond, and depending on what happens in Dallas, that Tony Pollard is definitely a viable running back that can handle a decent share and be productive with it. So definitely think this was a win, especially with the late news. Cam Akers, obviously the game script didn't go in his favor. I did mention the Rams being very game script dependent, and obviously the game got turned on his head, so they ended up throwing the ball more. Cam also was hurt for a portion of that game, but even with that, he still had 18 looks, 15 on the ground and 3 targets, and had 88% of the Rams rushing share. So still was very solid. Didn't have the performance that we would have liked from a result standpoint, But throughout the week, Cam Akers was my best value, and I think that I would go back there 100 out of 100 times given the same type of setup. So just didn't work out this time from a results standpoint, but didn't really hurt us because a lot of people were on Cam Akers, so didn't end up mattering too much. Lynn Bowden Jr. was the one that was a little bit shaky to me in this lineup, and that really had everything to do just with the touchdown equity, given that the game had a very low Vegas projection as far as the over-under is concerned. So, he did see solid target share, got 26% of the targets, played 90% of the snaps, and again, with the late news on the Miami receivers and their main tight end being out, that pushed me on to Bowden being a solid value option there. I was still kind of shaky on it, but if you look at this lineup, he looks to me like the last person into this lineup, and in that case, I'm perfectly fine with it. With regards to DeAndre Hopkins, he was the number one wide receiver player on my board. I mentioned that in my preview video, and he did exactly what he was supposed to do. Gave you the number one wide receiver vibe, so we definitely like that. And I can kind of mention the last or the next three sort of together in the Kansas City and New Orleans game being a game that I had talked about looking at as a potential game stack. And especially once Michael Thomas was ruled out and more production was going to be available to some of the other players, and namely some of the value options on New Orleans, I felt that it was important to get those value options into my lineup here for cash. Emmanuel Sanders was targeted down the field, just didn't really, get to connect on that play that got into the end zone with Drew Brees. I think he was stopped on the 4-yard line, I believe, on the big catch that he had. And Brees himself wasn't his same efficient self. I think he completed less than 50% of his passes, so that obviously negatively affected the passing game for New Orleans and the game in general, so also had an impact on Kamara. And I think that even though there was a solid amount of scoring in that game and the game hit the over, that it was somewhat underwhelming in a sense, but that can happen sometimes. And Sanders was still okay, didn't harm us too much in our lineups, and he was reasonably popular as well. And I think that given the setup with Michael Thomas being out, that he was a strong play there, so I don't hate that play. Travis Kelce is the number one tight end on the board, and gives us access to a ceiling that most tight ends just can't reach. We can even look at this performance from Kelce as being sort of a down performance compared to some of his recent production, but even in that, he still was the number one tight end as far as fantasy scoring on Fanduel on the main slate this week. So seeing that he can easily do that, I think is really valuable. This spot pretty much came down to the same thing as last week, whether I was going to play Derrick Henry in this lineup or play Travis Kelce. And because of the plethora of value that I was seeing at running back, I mentioned Tony Pollard, Akers, Fournette. I think J.K. Dobbins could have been someone that was worth mentioning there. That I was better off getting in, some of that value and paying up elsewhere, namely at tight end where Kelce's ceiling was pretty much unmatched. So I went there. I think, having a value option at tight end and going up to like a Derrick Henry or, coming off of, one of the values for a stronger play at wide receiver could have definitely been an option. So wouldn't have hated that. But, anytime you have Kelce in cash, I think that, he's a reasonable value given his floor of production and the ceiling that he has as far as touchdown equity and volume. Kamara, once Brees was ruled in, I felt like that was a really big boost to his potential production. Didn't really turn out in the results, but he did have 17% of the targets, which was actually first on the team. And he got vultured by Murray on a pass play, ironically. So that'll happen sometimes. He still put up a reasonable performance. Could have been better. But if Brees is more efficient there, maybe that game actually turns up a little bit better for Kamara and some of the other pass catchers. But I think from a process standpoint, once Brees was ruled in, that made Kamara much more viable, especially in comparison to Taysom Hill being in the lineup. I would have wanted no parts of Kamara with Taysom Hill in, even at this salary. And with the Rams defense, obviously they lost to the Jets, so that was unfortunate for them. Rams defense was really popular, so it didn't really hurt us too much. And I did mention that there weren't really a lot of low salary defenses that I really liked this week. So that to me made paying up at defense more viable. But generally speaking, I preferred not to pay all the way up at defense. In this case, there was also a lot of value that made it more viable, I think, to pay up at defense as well. Obviously, Rams didn't work out from a results standpoint and usually wouldn't be a strong part of my process, but they made it in this week. And I think staying nimble week to week is obviously important. With regard to some takeaways here, I think that, the first thing is it's really important to stay nimble to late news and be able to react to it. NBA season is coming up, so that's a much more regular occurrence in NBA versus NFL. We normally don't see that many changes to lineups, that close to lineup lock that can change the slate in its entirety. So, with that in mind, I think it's really important to react to late news properly. I feel like the double up players at my stakes played Pollard in 60 to 65% of lineups, so they reacted really well. I think that, when there's late news coming up, you just want to make sure that you can react to it and sort of have a plan in your process for how you're going to react to that news. So being that I've played a lot of NBA, even though it's a very challenging sport, I think I was ready once that news happened. I knew what I wanted to do pretty much with the way I was projecting certain players and then getting that into a tool like Fantasy Cruncher to help me build my lineups and then giving me more time to sort through them and figure out what I'm going to enter and where I'm going to enter it. I think it's really important to think about that, for cash and for tournaments, how you're going to react to late news really in any sport. And secondly, as we can see here with this lineup, I had essentially 4 duds in my main cash lineup and still was able to, beat the field in double ups and most head-to-heads. And, that's just a point that you don't need extreme ceilings in cash games. But in addition to that, a high ceiling can be very helpful. So if you have players that have access to a high ceiling, and in this case, with this lineup, if we look at Lamar or DeAndre Hopkins or Kelce, as far as where they project versus other players at their position, I think that it's helpful to get players that have access to high ceilings, especially in head-to-heads where scores can be very variant on a week-to-week basis. So you do want players that have a floor that can get you a reasonable production even when things don't go well, but also players that can get you a ceiling when things go right, that can help you sort of pick up the pieces if certain other parts of your lineup fall off. Those are some takeaways there that I think are valuable for cash. So let's check out how we did in tournaments. So here are my tournament exposures with a couple of my top GPP lineups over on the right side. I mentioned Tony Pollard already and just wanting to get to him in abundance once the news broke. I felt like there just wasn't enough time for his popularity to get to where it probably should have been in tournaments. So as far overweight as I could there, I think was solid. I mentioned Cam Akers and Alvin Kamara as well being, staples of my lineups also here in GPPs. And I was pretty concentrated at tight end, at least at the top as far as having Kelce and Hockenson. Hockenson didn't do all that well, but the game I think set up for him to have a solid performance on a normal basis. We saw that production end up going to Marvin Jones, and I'll talk about that game in particular in a sec. And then my 4 quarterbacks. So I ended up with Brady, Mahomes, Lamar, and Kyler there as my 4 quarterbacks for this week. And I always talk about wanting to be more concentrated on quarterbacks with the idea being that I want to have access to a quarterback or multiple quarterbacks, if I'm fortunate, that has an outlier performance. And I want to have as many of those lineups with that quarterback and with combinations of them with other pieces that can potentially get me to the top of a leaderboard. And in this case, I actually hit with 2 of those quarterbacks in Murray and Jackson. And then in addition to that, Brady and Mahomes put up performances that made it relatively easy to cash with those quarterbacks. So we weren't really drawing dead there. in performance, they actually cashed 54% of my entries, which is really high. But, that also allowed me to get some lineups that, had a shot at running up to the top. So this particular lineup here, the first one, ended up finishing in 18th in the 20 max snap. So that was awesome. And, had a shot at potentially taking down, a pretty decent score. So, that's really all you can ask for there. I think as far as some takeaways there, being open to game stacking without the quarterback is a viable solution, especially if it's a game where the Vegas projection is expected to be relatively high, and multiple of those options are value options. So I mentioned this here, and you can see in this my best lineup with Detroit and Tennessee. Obviously once Stafford was ruled in, I think that made me just higher on this game as a whole. It still ended up getting out of hand, but I felt like that gave Detroit more of a chance to keep up, where the game could have, slingshot back and forth. But, with Swift and Jones in particular on the Detroit side, they ended up accounting for most of the touchdown equity, where Stafford didn't actually end up getting a ton of work. And they both outscored Stafford. And at the quarterback position, Stafford was outscored by a mile, despite a couple of the skill position players having big performances. And, if you can target, players that do have access to a high touchdown equity in these type of situations, and, in most cases, using a running back and wide receiver, stack there where you're getting access to both the rushing touchdown equity and the passing game touchdown equity, I think that it can be viable. So isn't necessarily like my regular go-to build, but I think having those options, especially when there's a value option included, is viable there. So being open to that and being flexible to making those type of builds and entering them in tournaments, I think is solid. In addition to that here, I think playing multiple value options from the same team is fine. Even if they're at the same position, and it can be very situational. So I think we saw that with New Orleans, for example, this week. Wouldn't have worked out from a results standpoint, but once Michael Thomas was ruled out, we could see a lot of targets and potentially touchdown equity going to Emmanuel Sanders and Traquan Smith, who were both priced at 5,500 or less on Fanduel. And, if they were to both have, solid to above average performances, even if they don't necessarily provide you outlier performances on their own, or maybe one of them does, that can still be a viable option, especially if you have access to the touchdown equity there as well. So I think that's an okay thing to do. And as you can see here with Swift and Jones, even though they play a different position, and I think that it's more reasonable in that regard, particularly because I have a game stack here, that I think that it's okay to play multiple value options if you, are afforded them and they have, a high touchdown equity in a game that is projected to score a lot of points. In addition to that, I think that concentrating on some of the smaller fields is going to be more of my strategy going forward. I did mention this on my Twitch stream that I wanted to do that this week, and normally my number of lineups that I play has been in excess of like 450 plus, and that's because I've been playing 3 of the 150 max tournaments on FanDuel. This week I cut that down to 2, and I replaced some of that entry price with some smaller max and smaller cap contests, playing more of the single entries and some of the 3 and 5 max tournaments on FanDuel. And I think if you're looking to try to use tournaments as part of a strategy to build more of a bankroll, obviously tournaments can be very highly variant. So you do have to be careful with a lot of those larger field tournaments where they're essentially sort of lottery style. There's a lot of the payout up at the top, and to get access to that, you have to put up a really huge performance. Whereas in some of the smaller fields, it's a little bit easier to get to the top of a tournament. And when you have a lineup that performs really well, enters into one of those tournaments, you only have to beat out less of the field to get a really solid return. And I'll illustrate that by showing you how this tournament lineup performed if I entered it into a couple of different contests. So I mentioned that I entered that tournament lineup into the snap in the 20 max snap. And I finished in 18th out of roughly 29,700 lineups. So definitely had a really strong lineup there. I was able to beat a large percentage of the field, and also just a lot of entries in general. Some of those being my own. But if I was to take that same lineup and put that into the Sunday Million here, notice instead of finishing 18th, I would have finished in a tie for 182nd. And I actually looked at all these lineups. All these lineups are different, so I would have had a unique lineup that would have also tied here as well. In the snap, finishing 18th paid out $75, which was solid. On a $2 entry. Here on a $4 entry, that would have paid out only $50. So we would have actually beaten a larger number of people in that this tournament has over 400,000 entries, but we would have actually made less on our return with that particular lineup. Now, obviously, the Millie is going to have a much higher payout at the very top if you're able to get there. So, I'm not saying not to take shots at some of these larger tournaments where you can win, money that might be, life-changing or bankroll changing, but definitely to incorporate some of the smaller field contests as well. And I'll show you how that same tournament lineup would have placed in a much. As you can see, the lineup that scored 187.34 points would have actually finished second in this tournament for $1,000. So, not to, obviously cry over spilled milk here with that particular entry. That's not really the purpose of this. The purpose is that, to point out that smaller field tournaments can be very viable for being able to, help you build a bankroll more so than some of the larger lottery style tournaments. So that's going to be something that I continue to implement as well. And I think it's, still a strategy that I'm trying to figure out as well with the right allocation to the amount of cash games versus tournaments and, the right tournaments to mix in. So, and I continue to learn and grow there. But I think that particular, piece of information is really helpful. And this particular tournament only had 4,000 entries. So, when you do have a lineup that hits an outlier performance, and it gets you to the top, you still have access to a solid ceiling as far as a return is concerned as well. So definitely take that into account when considering where you want to place your tournament lineups and the contest that you're selecting as well. All right, so that wraps up the Week 15 recap. I hope that you found this helpful. It was just as enjoyable recording this whole video the second time as it was the first time, but I have to make sure that I don't have my mic muted next time I try to record a video on my channel. So again, if you enjoyed this content, definitely like and subscribe. That's going to help the channel grow. I greatly appreciate all of the support as well. And hit the notification bell so that you know when new video content goes live. The NBA season is coming up, so I'll be posting some NBA content as well. And in addition to that, I do go live on Twitch multiple times during the week. I'll be going live for the NBA Christmas slate on Christmas Eve. So the link to my Twitch stream is in the description. Definitely check that out and throw me a follow over there so that you know when I'm going live. And in addition to that, I go live every Saturday night before the NFL slate on Sunday. That's when we dive deep into more of the slate and figure out some of the strategy that we may want to take into tournaments. So definitely feel free to join me there, and I'd love to see you. I hope that your lineups did well this week, and if not, I hope that you got some lessons here that'll help you do better next week and beyond, especially if you're taking your talents to NBA or some other DFS sports. Until next time, peace.